This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. My guest this week is the musician Derek Webb. Derek started his career as a member of the popular band Caveman's Call and has also spent the last decade or so producing his own solo albums. In the first half of this extended conversation, Derek and I talk about his experience within the CCM industry, and then in the second half we talk about his most recent album, Fingers Crossed. The response to that album led Derek to start a podcast of his own called The Airing of Grief, to share interviews with people who've left their faith of origin behind and help provide the catharsis needed by expressing that pain and grief for others to hear. Both the album and the podcast are wonderful, so please visit the URLs to both in the show notes for this episode to buy his music and subscribe to his podcast. Now, if this is your first time listening to Evangelical, please go ahead and hit subscribe and dive into the back catalog. You'll find interviews with all sorts of artists, musicians, authors, bloggers, podcasters, activists, and private individuals who've told their own stories of living evangelicalism. You can also join the Evangelical Facebook group to find other like-minded folks to meet or listen to, or talk to, commiserate with, tell jokes with. It's a really lively community, and if you would benefit from that, please look it up and join it. We have nearly 2,000 members to date, and it's just a wonderful community. If you enjoy this show and do want to support it, you can do so in 3 different ways. First, you can support the show via Patreon at patreon.com/evangelicalpod. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, which will help boost the show. And finally, you can tell others about the show. If you know someone who can benefit from hearing others tell their stories of coming to terms with the messed up subculture that is evangelicalism, please do so. Every little bit helps. As a last note, if you're into Twitter, you can follow me there at brchastain, and you can follow the show at evangelicalpod. All right, everyone, let's get into it. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Evangelical. My guest this week is Derek Webb. He is a musician, an entrepreneur, and most recently, a podcaster. I'm very excited to talk to him. So welcome to the show, Derek.
Oh, man. It's just a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah.
So a lot of people already know you because you are a well-known musician. You've been performing for, over 15, 20 years? Something like that?
Yeah. My first band was this Texas-based folk kind of band called Caveman's Call, and we started that band in like '92. So it's been a long time.
Yeah. So a lot of people do know you and know you from your music, but let's get into a little bit about where you grew up and just learn a little bit about that, as well as sort of what your initial religious upbringing was like as well.
Yeah. So I grew up in the South, and so I feel like that I could probably just stop. I grew up in the South. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and grew up with parents who were religiously concerned, but not really religiously active. So my mom grew up what was it? Was she? I always get this wrong. I would usually say that my mom grew up Baptist and my dad grew up Catholic. I know I'm right about my dad. My mom might have actually grown up Methodist, but my mom grew up kind of mainline, kind of Protestant, and my dad grew up in a very Catholic, very, very, kind of serious Catholic family. They had some pretty highfalutin church leadership in their family, and so and he went to Catholic school and that sort of thing. And my mom grew up playing from when she was really little. Grew up playing the organ and being part of the music, like helping lead the music and in her church. And so when it came to me and my brother, I have one brother who is almost 4 years older than me. And so when it came to us, they definitely raised us in church, and we mostly went to Methodist church, which I've always kind of thought of, at least the kind of Methodist churches we were going to felt to me like a bit of a compromise between how they both kind of came up. Mm-hmm. And it was definitely important to them in terms of them clearly thinking that it was a good thing to believe and a good way to grow up. And so we always went to church. We weren't super involved or anything, but we went, weekly. And I grew up going to like Sunday school and then youth group, and went to the church where I went in Memphis, which was a United Methodist church. For those who are interested in that sort of thing, I actually went to school there. Also, they had a private school, so I went 1st through 6th grade to that school also. So that involved like going to chapel a couple times a week and kind of regular Bible teaching and that sort of thing. And so, but my parents, I mean, I like my parents a lot. Like I'm really close to my parents, and I kind of like how they did it. I mean, I don't think it was an especially bad way to grow up being in church, and that being for me some kind of a social anchor for me. Like I was a pretty awkward kid. Like everything that is valued during your adolescence, all those things, social, academic, sports, all the things that are kind of being examined and measured. I was terrible at all those things. And so, but I was good at music from when I was really little. Like I'm in my early 40s now, and so I'm pretty self-aware. I know myself pretty well, and I'm not good at hardly anything. I'm terrible at most things, but there are a few things that I'm good at, and the few things I'm good at, I'm super good at, and I know what they are, and I'm not shy about it. And from when I was really young, I mean, I have to emphasize those things because mostly I'm horrible at everything. And so the things that I have found over my many years that I have found came easy for me, I have really latched onto and really grabbed, and held. And music was that for me when I was really young, 5, 6, 7 years old. But I was an awkward kid, I didn't fit in very well. And so church, growing up, going to those kind of youth groups and Sunday school deals, like it was nice. It was like the other kids like had to hang out with me, right? Because we were all there kind of stuck. And as I think about it, it was kind of equalizing. It was kind of, because no matter where we all came from or who we were in school, anybody who grew up in church or going to like youth group and stuff, that it's a different thing than everything else you're doing. Right. So it kind of sets everybody off their game a little bit. So if you're like a really great sports type, or you're a really beautiful girl, or you're a really high achieving, academic type, none of that really matters when you get into Sunday school. Like everybody's just kind of looking at each other, like not really sure what's going on. And like, so that was good. That was an okay thing for me. And it was by way of that as I got out of, and that was kind of my, so I grew up with it casually, and then halfway through high school had like a conversion experience. I was mixed up in Young Life, which is, a high school parachurch organization, like a non-denominational parachurch organization, and wound up going to Young Life. My brother was real involved in it, and he kind of pulled me into that, and that was a pretty cool thing too. And it was cool because the guy who was the Young Life leader in my area. Now at this time I was in Texas, so right around just before high school, my family moved to Texas, so I was living in Houston, still in the South, and the guy who was the leader was this really peculiar, fascinating guy. He was a highly intellectual. He was kind of nerdy. Like he was like, and like in a way that I really admired and thought was really cool, and like a real thinker. And as I have gone on, realized like kind of not, in my opinion, a super typical kind of young life leader type. He wasn't like really cool and really, he was extroverted, but he was really more of a thinker. And I really liked that. And he was very intuitive, and he could see about me that that music was the biggest part of my life. And that he knew that was a good thing to anchor me in to young life. And he was right. And so it gave me like a musical identity. I grew up playing in bands my whole life. I grew up playing in rock cover bands and whatnot, and was kind of confused about what to do with music around when I got saved in probably after my sophomore year, like high school. I didn't really know. And so I kind of hit the brakes for a second, because I was like, can I go on being in these bands? Or because you're kind of hearing the narrative that like, this is a moment where you need to take stock and take inventory and maybe change something, maybe make some changes in your friend group. And so I remember thinking, and that sometimes those changes can be real watershed kind of moments.
Right.
And those can be moments where you feel like you either pulled a flag up out of the ground or put one down. And I remember thinking, I think I need to make a change. I think I need to quit this band. And I was in a really good band actually at that time in high school, but I was kind of pumping the brakes on that. And that was right around when I got mixed up in Young Life and got pulled in to play music for that, which was a great thing for me. It was a real confidence booster, and it gave me, every week I was up in front of not my friends, but people some of whom would go on to be some of my friends, and but people who were going through that same experience. And I had a thing that I could do that, where most of them had clear gifts or, were cool or whatever, and I wasn't. It gave me something. It gave me an identifier, and I really appreciated that. And those were great times. And I went to all the summers. I went to those Young Life camps and did those trips, ski trips and summer trips, and it was great, honestly. I mean, I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the friends that I made, and that was all pretty cool. And then by the end of high school, kind of didn't go to college, but almost did, but really kind of didn't. And but the kind of big life-changing moment right then was that a friend of mine that I'd gone to high school with, who was a little older than me and who was also mixed up in Young Life. I knew he was like really into cool music, but what I didn't know is that he was an unbelievable songwriter. I didn't know this about him, but we were friends, and he was a little older than me. We had friends in common who were between our two ages, because he was 2 years my senior. And so I got a random call from him, what would have been my freshman semester of college. And I kind of dabbled in community college in Houston for a minute, but it didn't stick. I didn't stay. But during that time, he called me and asked me if I wanted to join a band. And I was like, it had been a minute since I'd been in a band, because I was still trying to sort that out with my newfound faith or whatever. And so he told me this story about how there was this guy who he met, because he was at TCU, Texas Christian University. He was at TCU in Fort Worth, and met this guy who was also from Houston, who, as the mythology goes, around the way our band started, this other guy walked past my friend's dorm room and heard him playing some of his songs, and walked in and was like, "Wow, these are super good songs. What do you do with that?" And my friend was like, "I don't do anything with it. I write them and that's it." And this other guy was like, "Well, like, these are super good songs, and you should play them. Do you want to do you want to start a band or anything? And my friend said no. And cause he wasn't really much of a musician. He was just a kind of a savant songwriter. And so this other guy said, well, could I start a band and play your songs? He was kind of an opportunist, but he was really smart and he was a visionary and he saw an opportunity. So, and my friend said, Aaron Tate is his name, my friend Aaron. And so Aaron said, yeah, that's cool. If you want to. And so this other guy, Cliff Young is his name, said, okay, awesome. Can you introduce me to any musicians? He was like, had no idea how to start a band. And he himself had only just started playing guitar. And so Aaron's first thought was to call me because had somewhat of a reputation by the end of high school for being a musician. I'd been in a bunch of bands. And so, and I was into the same kind of music, kind of contemporary folk music, Indigo Girls, that sort of thing. And so he called me and said, can I introduce you to this guy, Cliff? And he wants to play my songs and start a band. And I was like, yeah, that's cool. So met up with this guy, Cliff, and heard a bunch of Aaron songs, which were really tremendous, remarkable, good songs. And we hit it off. And what could be a very long story short, we found a handful of other musicians and started this band Caveman's Call. This was in 92. And so we were based in Houston. This was pre-internet, as you might calculate, from the year. But we were an indie band, and Cliff's dad is still the pastor of a really, really big kind of megachurch in Houston, Second Baptist Church. It's a very kind of more old school, big choir, robes, old school preacher, kind of Southern Baptist megachurch. And so Cliff's dad was the pastor there, and his brothers were both, Baptist ministers or whatever. And he was kind of resisting the family business though. And so he was looking to play music. But because that church had all these amazing resources, they had a recording studio, for God's sake,
wow.
in their church. And in the early 90s, that was pretty unheard of. It was cost prohibitive to be able to make a record without a record deal. That's why there was no middle class until after Napster, And so, but we were able to record some of our music, and within a few years had a couple of indie records out, and we're starting to tour. And because we were college age and all our friends were in Texas colleges, and there's a bajillion colleges in Texas, so you can make a pretty full time gig out of just touring around Texas colleges. And we were doing that, and then wound up getting signed to an imprint of Warner Brothers a few years later, and that was a 10-year run with that band, and we put out, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 records, and we sold into the millions of records. And back when bands could do that, bands like us, anyways. And so, and those were great years. And we wound up, we toured mostly colleges, but some churches, and wound up getting marketed to the Christian music world because the record labels that we were signed to, by no fault of their own, this is their job. Their job was to sell our records. And as they were looking for some way to market us, they realized that most of us were, kind of Christians, and that was the way we saw the world. And so they thought, well, that'd be a great way to market you guys. And that really worked. And so we had like a lot of success in the Christian music world. And we were on a label with bands like Jars of Clay and Third Day and, and like cool bands who were making a great run at it and having a lot of success at that time. And so
I worked in a Christian bookstore then. Right.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Yeah. So our records might have crossed your path.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Yeah. Like Long Line of Leavers was a huge album for me personally.
Oh, that's crazy. That's what a small world, man. Well, and so that all kind of happened, and that was all, that was cool. I mean, those were great years, and it was fun because those were kind of I kind of think of those as my college years. Those 10 years we spent touring and putting records out, and then got married around the early 2000s and left the band at that same time. I decided 10 years was a long time, and had started to find my own voice as a writer, and started to kind of find my courage a little bit. And you spend 10 years playing in the Christian music scene, and you wind up with a lot of stories, and you wind up with a lot of questions, and you wind up with a lot of laundry that you want to air out, and things you want to talk about, or I did anyways. And so,
if you're able, could you expound on that a little bit? Because I think that's something that a lot of people are curious about, is sort of the machinations of CCM as sort of an industry, as well as like what it sort of, like, honestly, what sort of does to people, the sort of expectations it puts on the performers to be.
Well, yeah, no, that's a great. No, I'm happy to. And I mean, what's weird about it is you kind of wind up in this odd position of being like a professional Christian.
Yeah.
And so that's why, like, for people on the outside who don't know all the ins and outs, I would guess it would be pretty confusing over the years to hear about kind of scandals in the Christian music world, and then hear about Christians and kind of Christian retail and the Christian music scene kind of turning their back, because you're like, I thought that was the one thing you guys all claim to have in common, was the fact that you're all fuck ups, like you're all
right,
like you're all sinful or whatever. Why are you turning on somebody for the fact that it turns out it wasn't false advertising. It turns out they were telling you the truth. Like, you like people to talk about how they're sinful. You just don't want them to actually be sinful. Yeah. Like, you don't want to ever hear about it in public, but you love people who anecdotally confess. You just don't want it to be real.
Right.
And because that's happened, it happened to Amy Grant. It happened to Michael English. It's happened to a handful of people, and I'm getting real deep in the weeds here now because
but anyways, Ray Boltz,
Ray Boltz, that's exactly right, and others, and Kevin Max is a super good pal of mine. He was in a band called DC Talk, and he never got ostracized, but he definitely was an odd fit in that world, and that came down hard on him too, in like the 90s, and but anyways, so that's kind of this odd role that you wind up in, and as I said, like Christian in my, and I hope not to rabbit trail too much here, but Christian practice, as I understand it, is, or should be, or at its best could be, like recovery. It should be like an AA meeting. It should be a group of people gathering together with only one thing in common, and that's that they need to be restored and healed and helped. And even the guy in the front getting up and saying, hey, I'm so-and-so, and just like you, I'm a sinner, and let's all go get, healed together. I mean, that's, and yet most Christian, most kind of communal Christian practice is more like an Amway convention than an AA meeting.
Yeah.
It's more like, we've got a product to sell you, and everybody gather around.
Right.
And we're actually going to make evangelists of our product out of all of you, and then it becomes like a pyramid scheme, and like all of you go make converts, and those converts make converts, and it all trickles back up to the top, and so in practice it's odd. At its root, I think it has promise, maybe, the practice of it, and so and yet, that being true, there's this weird pressure, as one might imagine, to again, to kind of carefully craft language that talks about how, I'm a sinner just like everybody else, but really discourages or even punishes behavior that proves that out.
Yeah.
And so it puts you in an odd position.
Right.
Because, the job of an artist, as I see it, as I've always considered it for myself, is to look at the world and describe it. Look at the world, tell people what you see. That's the job description. And yet you wind up under a lot of pressure to not exactly do that. You can't really do it, because if you're completely honest, then you're going to wind up out of the typical territory that the Christian kind of machine or industry is comfortable with.
Yeah, because it would damage your witness.
It would not only damage your witness, I think that's true, but more importantly, interestingly, it would damage the mechanisms by which Christian product is distributed. That seemed to me where I always seemed to hit the guardrail. It wasn't ever like, oh, we're worried about your reputation and what people are going to think of you. Whenever I pushed boundaries in my career during those years, it seemed the pushback that I got was more, hey man, like, listen, we're with you on this and we get what you're saying and we like that you're a rabble rouser, but like, we can't put this record out and you saying this or you attacking, not attacking, but calling into question, asking questions about the church's, your own and therefore the church's politics and your own and therefore the church's views on homosexuality or, loving your neighbor radically, pacifism, nonviolence. We can't put your records out down the same pipeline that we're trying to put out Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir or, Mercy Me, or, I mean, some of these bands that actually are good friends of mine that I think are making cool music, but that are very explicit in the way they use Christian language. They're like, the labels and the distributors were just like, listen, we just can't do it, because if we fight for and put your record out, then they're going to punish us when it comes time to put out the next big Christian record that we've got to put out, which is the majority of what they were doing,
Right.
And
yeah, the bookstores and the
that's right.
And
it would
the
damage
public itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it would clog and damage the pipes. That was really more the concern that I ever got. Like, the labels never claimed to be or ever functioned as a moral guardrail or anything like that. Like, hey man, I don't know. It was always like, we don't know. That's cool. Or we get it and we support it, like, between you and me, but we've kind of got a business to run here, and, stop, making that difficult. So that was really more what it was. And so, but back to your question of like how that kind of works, it does make things pretty complicated, because if you want to even really do what I would consider a Christian artist's job, which I think any artist's job, and especially a Christian artist's job, in my opinion, has a very prophetic kind of element to it, and all I mean by that is like the speaking of truth to power. Mm-hmm. I think it's super important. I think that Jesus as a character was doing that constantly. That's what got him in so much trouble, was that he spoke truth to power. And he represented, in my opinion, kind of the upside down. It was an upside down power economy of power. Mm-hmm. He was poor. He was, and all these other things. And yet he would call the rich into question and the politically strong into question and things like that. And so it seems to me that Christian artists would, and really any artist, I mean, it's at least available to you to do it. And I think there is implicitly a prophetic element to art. But for Christian artists, I always kind of felt like that might be kind of important.
Yeah.
And yet as you try to do that, if you try, you find yourself quickly being pushed to the fringes, if not to the other side, and have to hurl that over the wall.
Right.
Which is weird, and it's a bummer. And so they don't really reward the doing of the job, at least the way that I always felt like the job could or should be done.
So just out of curiosity, is that why a lot of people in the late 90s started moving to primarily worship albums? Because because honestly, I remember, like, I was working and I was really into youth group culture right when I thought it was like a really fertile time for Christian music. Right. And all of a sudden in those last few years, like, all these bands that made great original music just shifted to worship music.
Yes.
Was that sort of a byproduct of that sort of thinking, and like a
Yeah, I think maybe so. I think that I have a story that I will tell you that is my suspicion for why that happened. But I can tell you that, like, before that time, Christian music was mostly just bad, but it wasn't offensive necessarily to me at that time as a believer in it.
Mm-hmm.
It was just bad. It was like people writing kind of not great songs that were passable because you could get a record deal with a Christian company if you were a really sweet person and had a really great testimony and were passable musically, and especially if you were kind of a designer imposter of something that was on secular radio, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you were like a Christian version, a Christian alternative to something that was popular, you could for sure get a record deal. And so as a result, the Christian business on the whole was putting out stuff that was a little substandard to me. It definitely wasn't good compared to, forgive a lot of spiritually coded language here, but it wasn't especially good compared to, like, let's say the creative mandate in the beginning of Genesis to, in other words, to make art about everything Jesus is Lord of, and to go and kind of redeem all things, and to the whole first chapter of the Bible is God making everything out of nothing, supposedly, and so the first thing that you learn about God, if you read the Bible, at least if you read it in the sequence that most Bibles are in, which is not necessarily chronological, but is that God was creative. In the beginning, God made, and then blah, 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 blah. And so he was creative. He made all things out of nothing. He was a good artist, apparently, because everything he made was very good in his estimation. And so as image bearers, again, coded language, forgive me for that, but as God's ambassadors to culture, made in his image, so to speak, then we should be the people making the best, most creative and original art in the scene. And yet we were the ones kind of making the stuff a couple years after it was cool on general market radio. There'd be like a Christian band who would do something kind of like it so that youth leaders had something to suggest to their kids instead of listening to the secular bands.
Right.
And so, so that I for a long time was what Christian music was. It was not great, but it was a kind of sugar-free alternative if you were looking for one, and if you felt like morally you needed to not listen to anything but Christian music or whatever, which really is just a marketing term. I mean, I won't spend any time on this, but the phrase I like to use is that the word Christian, when used to describe anything other than a human being, is a marketing term. That's which is not to say that it's not helpful when used to describe other things. It just can't mean what it means when people use it to describe people. Only people have souls that can be saved. Only the redeemed people are supposedly the ones in heaven. But the redeemed music, I mean, like Christian music, Christian bookstores, Christian education, Christian breath mints, none of that stuff, just because someone rubber stamped it as Christian, which is really just a marketing term, does not mean that that's the only stuff that's going to be in heaven. The same way that people talk about humans. And so, but Christian music, which is again is a fiction, it's not a real thing. Was mostly just kind of benign and designer imposter and that sort of thing. What happened was sometime in the 90s, as you said, there was this pivot, and a lot of the Christian music, at least what was on the radio, started to become this worship music, which I prefer to call worship product, is really what it is, and is a more descriptive for me. And so what happened was, and it was all this, it's the only thing that's on Christian radio now. If you for some reason want to tune in and find Christian radio, mostly what you'll hear sounds like songs that could be sang by a congregation in churches. They're not performed in a way that would be easy for congregations to sing because they're being sung by, great singers. And so and most great singers don't know how to square up their melodies and make it make it easier for congregations to sing. That's a whole different set of skills, in my opinion. But that's the content. That's the language. It's a lot of, whatever it is, a lot of that kind of stuff. And here's what I think happened. And I don't know if I've told this story very much, but I was kind of, our band was kind of there watching the sausage get made a little bit in this moment.
Yeah.
And we were on this label with, as I said, Jars of Clay and Third Day and Plum and All Star United, a lot of cool bands. And so I remember the day that we went into we had a meeting at the label, and we went in, and it was maybe that same week or something that the VP that was our guy there was telling us that he had met with the Third Day guys. And the Third Day guys, Mac Powell, who's the lead singer of Third Day, super good guy, sweet guy, really pastoral, really has that in him in terms of his wiring. And he and those guys had been talking to the label about the fact that at the end of their shows they were doing, they would include some of these praise choruses. And the thing is, at the time, worship music was not a thing. It wasn't. It was used in church services, but it wasn't a thing. Like, bands didn't like play worship songs for people, like, other than in that environment. But at these Third Day shows, they would play a couple of worship songs at the end, and it was just this cool thing they were doing, this bonding moment, and their fans really loved it. And Mac was kind of basically saying, this is a thing that is organically happening, and we'd like to record a bunch of them. And we've even we're starting to write some, and we'd like to record some worship songs and put that out as our next record. And the label basically said, we think that's the stupidest idea we've ever heard. Like, that doesn't make any sense. No one's going to buy that. It's so niche. Like, if you guys want to do that, you can spend your own money to do it. We won't really get behind it, but we'll drop it in our distribution. But you guys are kind of be on your own, because we don't really see that making any sense or making financial sense. We just don't think it'll sell. But be our guest if you want to go do something, And so they did. They recorded a lot of live stuff, but recorded this record that they called Offerings. And it was a lot of live performance stuff, and it was some other songs. And they turned it in, and the label put it out thinking it would just drop like a rock. And I could be wrong, but I think it was maybe Third Day's biggest selling record up to that point. I mean, it really took off. It was just a huge moment and a real surprise to everybody, and everybody just loved it. And they weren't necessarily the first ones to record worship choruses, but it was a turning point. It was a watershed, and nobody saw it coming. And basically within the year, the label had come to every other band on that label, and basically said, so we need everybody to record a worship record because that is selling like hotcakes. And again, it's like, there might, a lot of people like to make this divide about Christian and secular, whatever that means. My friend David Dart is fond of saying that there's arguably not a secular molecule in the universe. I might even argue, I might argue the other side, that maybe there's only secular molecules in the universe. But I love David, and I love the way his brain works, and he's a guy I respect a lot. But anyways, I think that is to say, I think the divide is ridiculous and doesn't make any sense. And I think it's all about marketing and fear and capitalism. But that's really what it was about. They were like, we just think this is what's going to sell. Some of you guys and some of these bands, you've been, kind of fighting for a hit for a couple of years. You haven't really found one. We're just telling you, this is what you got to do. And so they were pressuring, not pressuring, but kind of pressuring everybody into putting out worship records. That's right around the time that I left Caedmon's, because it was part of who we were kind of organically, but it wasn't ever really part of our music up to a certain point. And then the band decided to do that because it's like, well, if we don't put out a worship record, then the label won't let us put out the next record we want to put out. So it's kind of one for you, one for me. And so the band did it, and I understood why, and I respected that decision. But again, I was getting married around that time, and it makes you take inventory of how of what you're doing and the time you're spending on what, and so it felt like the right moment. But in my opinion, I think it could all be Third Day's fault. I think I think that they found a market for that, and kind of vetted the market and determined that, wow, okay, people will pay a lot of money for worship music, and I think that was at least a major factor in lighting the fuse on that. But but yeah, I didn't like the restraints that our band had experienced in terms of the content that we were talking about before. There was, 90 some odd % of all Christian art, I'm using finger quotes, is about just a few things. It's about kind of transcendent moments of worship and the afterlife. That's mostly what it's all about now, and not much else. And so you kind of find yourself in a little bit of no man's land when you want to write about other things. And I was very interested in politics and sexuality and war and a lot of things, and didn't really find a lot of places to put that, especially the bigger our band got. Because what happened to us and what happens to a lot of bands, and this isn't just a problem for Christian bands, this is what happens to any band that gets popular or has a moment of success, is that when you first start out, you're really low to the ground, everything's organic, you're trusting your instincts. Any popularity that you find is usually based on your trusting those instincts. And then something happens, and your platform gets taller, and it rises. Sometimes it rises really fast. And then all of a sudden you find yourself quickly in the platform building business and the platform sustaining business. And the higher that platform gets, the harder and harder and harder it gets to really do the job that puts you there, which is to look at the world and describe it, and to be super honest about what you see, and to disrupt if need be, and to challenge status quo if need be. The higher that platform gets, and the more livelihoods are tied to that platform being tall and stable, you find yourself terrified to ever ascend it again, to say anything on top of it that could get you knocked down or it knocked over. So it makes the job really hard, especially trying to be an artist who's got some kind of a spirit, like a religious worldview. And I just found myself uncomfortably atop such a platform, in Caedmon's, because we'd gotten popular. And so it felt like a good time to start over. And because I was writing songs increasingly that didn't fit and felt like too big of a risk for our band, because we had a lot of people paying attention, and I was wanting to say things that were a little more complicated and a little more nuanced on some of those topics. And so that's what kind of led me into my solo career. I mean, that is 20 more minutes than you needed on that, but
no, that's great. I
but
think,
interestingly, it's a thing that in that kind of detail, I don't really feel like I've ever really recounted. And so it's interesting, even for me, considering the conversations you typically have with people about kind of faith journeys, in and out. If there's significant things in there, then I'd rather have them on the record. But yeah, and so that's what started me in my solo career, which started, in a strange way, because my first record didn't get carried in a lot of Christian bookstores for language and content, because I was getting into complex parts of the Bible that talked about, the church being adulterous, and like Ezekiel 16, where it talks about the church, God's people being a whore, and it's like there's rough language back there, and about idolatry, and about kind of the language of the prophets and stuff, and that sort of thing, gets you to tricky water pretty quick. And so but I had the wind at my back of having spent 10 years in a pretty popular Christian band, so I had a lot of support out of the gate. So I was able to navigate my early solo career in a way that with a luxury that most artists wouldn't have, because I had a lot of people who would support me and who would come out and see me play, and because I was coming off of that band. And so, so I spent that currency pretty wisely, or pretty. I was wisely was not the right word. I was careful with it, and I was intentional about what I wanted to do with it, because I knew I would only have a finite amount of it before I would get ultimately kind of shoved out of the circle. But
Yeah.
and so I spent a lot of those the years of my solo career making records about that stuff. About, I've got whole records about race and sexuality and war and peace and politics and idolatry and all that sort of stuff. So
Right.
and that's kind of been the hallmark of my solo career, which I'm still in, but I'm just in a new season of belief or disbelief. But that's kind of the reputation that I got, and to the point where my people actually would be disappointed if I didn't upset them with some kind of gnawing at the hand that was feeding me during a lot of those years. And so I got comfortable at that.
This morning I woke up with a hangover and a tattoo bandage and another old song I can't remember. And it's a tempest in a teacup, a 2-drink minimum. It's all together meaningless to me. 'Cause something deep down in my heart, something that made me who I was.
Your first solo album, She Must and Shall Go Free, I think it did. I think it did have that sort of quality that you alluded to with the sort of people that knew you from Caedmon's. I think that there were especially from just talking as a fan, like going from Long Line of Leavers, the songs that stood out to me on that album were your songs, like the What You Want and Dance. Like those were the ones.
That's so cool, man.
Like those were the ones that really stood out to me. And then at you're sort of leaving the band, and then that album coming out, sort of, pardon me, it lined up just within my particular narrative, because it was like right around the time when I was on Christian college campus and the Iraq War was happening, and I disagreed with that.
Right.
Like there's all this shit happening, and
That's
then
right.
I go back to my hometown for the summer. And then someone that I played in like our youth worship band and was like, "Did you know that Derek Webb like has this album where he calls the church a whore?" Like, and so it did have like an edgy quality to it, in that sort of way that I think only people from this particular culture understand what edgy means. It's like,
right, exactly. Like, wow, he said horror.
Yeah,
I get the controversy.
Yeah,
it's like that's totally right. Yeah,
yeah. So like, but that, I mean, to your point, like I think that you did do that well. You stepped out and you made some statements that within those particular confines are really, really controversial. It's not, and I think the year that it was, the internet was still really early. I mean, it hadn't even been 10 years. I think they consider the beginning of like the modern internet at like 96. So it hadn't even been 10 years. But it was like getting out there. And so that is super interesting that to hear from you that is like where you were and that's what you were processing through your music then and throughout the subsequent albums as well.
Yeah. I just feel like I went into my solo career with just like an irrational bravery because of the combination of having come out of Caedmon's for 10 years and the success that we had and being newly married, which, suddenly, providing this support that you've never had in your life before in that feels quite like that does. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly I was like, oh, I could do anything, because what's the worst that could happen? Because that somebody's got your back. And and that's not the only way to feel that way, but it was pretty life-changing for me at that time. And so I think those things all combined just set me on this trajectory of like, man, I'm going to spend every dime of this currency really carefully, and I'm going to just really dig this thing up by the root. And so it was, which I feel like I'm pretty well suited for. Like I'm wired to be pretty contrary. Like I play devil's advocate very easily and very naturally, and primarily with myself. Like I feel like I got a little bit of a bad reputation for just giving the church shit a lot for a lot of those years, and I think that may be true. It may be a little inarguable if you look at the records, but ultimately that was not my intention. It wasn't my intention to do that any more than it was to be intentionally provocative. I was in my crosshairs, and I was the one mainly that I was going after, and that I was, it was my own conventions and beliefs that I was really going after. And anybody who was particularly resonant with me or my story or how I grew up or whatever would probably find themselves resonant also with those records and maybe join me in those crosshairs. But I was the one that I was always really attacking. I was the one that I was going after. And so for that reason, you kind of never run out of material. And, because I live with myself every day. And but so it came pretty easy to me, is the point I think I'm trying to make, is that I spent those years, it was just easy. I would just look around, and whatever would either get me really excited or really angry or really worked up, that's what I was making records about during all those years. And that was kind of a pretty solid 10 years another 10 years, of my solo career, making records, kind of leaving breadcrumbs along my spiritual journey during all that time. And if you go through those records, you'll have a very clear sense of what really hit me the previous year, and that I wound up making a record about. Like, be it, when I really got into the theology of pacifism and nonviolence, or when I finally ran out of runway to give excuses anymore to Christians in culture or the institution in general, who were judging and condemning my friends and family in a lot of cases who were in the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. That was that kind of that was a big one, and then even like cultural kind of critiquing, looking at the technology and how it was, and it just, whatever it was, I just kind of found myself just bouncing from one big set of issues to another. I was like really going after it, and kind of felt that agitator critic role as kind of part of my job, and ultimately kind of figuring out like what do I have a hard time with, what really frustrates me about myself. Let me write about that, and then anyone who resonates, might buy it or might be interested. But that kind of was those are the coordinates I was following for all those years. In my job. Yeah. Yeah.
And so do you feel like there's I feel like we're coming up on the next part of your story where there's like another clear marker in the sand or in your life, because tell me if I have this wrong, basically.
Go for it.
But basically, like you, for another 10 years after you left Caedmon's, a very successful like CCM group, you moved on and you did your solo work, which still grappled with a lot of social and theological sorts of issues. So you had that sort of identity, even if it wasn't your own, it was like what your fans associated you with, of being like moving from being on a Christian label, which is like default evangelical, to like this sort of progressive Christian sort of stance.
I was playing faster and looser with the language the further I went, and I was and I was resisting it and challenging it and testing it increasingly over all those years. The guardrails and the confines of kind of Christian art. I mean, I really have always considered that maybe part of what would be important for me doing, more so for the artists who might come later and be far more popular than I ever have been in my career, but who might have needed some precedent or guidepost to give them some tiny bit of real estate upon which to stand and write songs that are more challenging, than what's going on around them. Yeah. And so I considered it, I did it pretty intentionally and considered it a pretty important part of my creative kind of work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, well, now I definitely want to sort of talk about your most recent album, and if that's too much of a segue, let me know.
It's great.
But you have your most recent album is called Fingers Crossed, and one of the ways in which I've heard it described by you is that it's like a tale of two divorces.
Yes.
So that is we haven't talked about either of those things yet in your story.
Yes.
But there was a personal divorce that happened in your life, and then also another personal one, but in a different way, more within the spiritual sort of sense of understanding your understanding of and your worldview, to use a very loaded sort of evangelical term. So that's what this album really encapsulates for you.
Yes. And
I think so. The way in which I learned about the album was actually when your Spirit Bears the Curse video came out, and so it I think it was released online, and I was on Twitter, and a prior guest and one of your friends, Jamie Lee Finch, posted about it, and so I saw
my
it.
dearest pals in the world. Yeah.
So I saw that, and then I just remember watching it for the first time, and I didn't necessarily know where it was going, but once it finished, it was such a crazy sort of statement, and then this great visual thing that I think only someone that has that lived experience can get and understand why it's subversive to those things. And that's sort of it seemed like in following you just online and seeing the sort of responses that were coming in, that did this album take people by surprise like that, in such a sort of intense way?
I think, so for the benefit of people who have not heard the song or seen the video or anything for it, just the super brief, I hate to give a spoiler.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. But
I will include the link in the show notes.
Oh, great. Okay. But I mean, basically the song is written, I kind of, so the whole Fingers Crossed record was written during and at the very beginnings of the other side of my spiritual deconstruction and my kind of leaving the faith, and it's kind of my going public about that, and then also documenting my divorce from my ex-wife, and who's also an artist, and so it was a in very small circles it was a semi-public kind of thing. And so the first song I released from the record is this song, The Spirit Bears the Curse. And what I wanted to do, so I found myself, as many do, on the other side or in the throes of spiritual deconstruction and kind of deconversion, and kind of working my way out of and processing and figuring out, how to feel about not believing. And as I was going through that, I found myself obviously not in churches or a church, and out of that situation, but re-congregating mostly in bars with, at least in Nashville, Tennessee, a lot of other people who found their way there for exactly the same reason. And having these amazing conversations and gathering in this one particular bar pretty often with a group of friends, all of us going through that at the same time. And there was just this moment where we were talking about how, that was one thing we really loved about the church, the practice of Christianity, was the congregating, the hanging out, the language and the shorthand that the church provides for you to basically articulate your shared experience, and then a place to practice it, and a place to congregate. And we really missed that. And we thought, well, that's what we're doing now. And it's, we're here in a bar or something, but we're partaking of the Spirit, so to speak. And, and we might not have the bread, but we've got the wine, and we're confessing to each other, and we're having fellowship in all that, so to speak. And somebody, I think offhand, said, well, the only thing we don't have is our own worship music. We don't have music. And I thought to myself, and said, as I recall, like, oh, well, I'll work on that, because that's kind of what I do. So, like, let me see if I can't write us something. And so I basically just got that idea in my head of like, oh man, like, I want to write, because I had never really written. I'd reworked some old hymns, and I had written like new melodies for some old, super like old, hundreds of years old hymn texts and stuff like that, as in different seasons of my career, and done some experiment with some stuff like that. But I'd never really sat down and written a worship song like we've been describing, like that kind of congregational, everybody get up in church and sing a song. I'd never really written a song like that before, in my own language. And I thought, you know what I want to do? I want to write the best worship song that I've never written, but have it be about this. Have it be about this, and so the great play on words that I found, the thing that I decided I would anchor it to, is alcohol. And so, as you were describing it, like the whole video and the song itself, it took me a while to kind of really craft it, but it's essentially a song that could easily be mistaken as a worship song about God.
Right. Yeah.
But the whole song is about, it's about alcohol, but really I use that as a catch-all term to be about, gathering with those people in that place.
Right.
And kind of finding community again, finding congregation outside of the church, in a place and by a name that had been previously at least frowned upon, if not prohibited. And so, and so the whole song, up until the last, let's say, 15 seconds, you think you're listening to a worship song. And then the last 15 seconds, when it finally says, so I'm calling out the only name that delivers me from guilt and shame, is the big stanza at the end, and then the whole thing breaks down, and then you think I'm going to say Jesus or something, and I say alcohol over and over again. And that was the first song I released from the record, which interestingly I felt like was probably the least provocative song on the record, and I thought would be a pretty decent warm-up. But I think people who were following, when you go through something hard and public and humiliating and shameful, which I did with my divorce, you kind of, as a person who makes their living somewhat in the public, you're kind of left not knowing where you stand, and you're kind of left not knowing where your people are and how they feel about you. And so I didn't really know what people were going to think. I didn't really know if people were interested in hearing me describe the world as I saw it, and if I would really even make music again. I took a little break for a few years while I was doing other things, because I also have some entrepreneurial spirit in me, and I have a few businesses that I run on the side that are all music related and things like that. And I'd focused my attention on those things for a few years and taken a break, and then finally came back to music, which I'm fully back into now. But and but I knew that the people who were really paying attention were not going to be surprised. And I had really intentionally tried to drop a lot of good hints and Easter eggs throughout to prepare people. And certainly my good friends knew exactly where I was. And but what's interesting was that when people heard that song, their first impulse was, oh man, it's Derek Webb up to his old tricks again. And apparently this is a commentary on modern worship music and about how vapid it is and how it's, like we need to, it's a sharp critique of worship music and meant to make us all see how it really needs to be, like about the true God and how we often make it about our idols and things like that. And what's interesting is, like, I could see that. I could see how it could be seen that way. And I could see how for 10 years I trained people with the music I was putting out for that to be the most likely thing that it was, that it was about, or the way that because what wouldn't have been a consideration was, or maybe he's had a really super fucking hard couple of years and he's been drinking a lot of alcohol. And that's proven very comforting to him in the place of a God who appears not to be there. Silence on the other end of the line, so to speak. And maybe that's a way that he's survived getting through the initial stages of deconstruction. That was not an option available to most people in their imaginations. And so they thought, here comes another sharp critique, from the neighborhood, professional prophet or something. And I think that's an interesting byproduct. I think that's an interesting ancillary interpretation, not at all what I was imagining or did not intend. It felt very desperate and confessional to me. But the record goes obviously much further, and it really does. I mean, it's just an autopsy, the whole Fingers Crossed record, to me, of processing my way through what it feels like to lose a spouse, to commit acts that drives someone away and to forces someone into the impossible situation of having to learn how to fall out of love with you. And in parallel and at the same time processing disbelief in a God who appears not to be there. And the one lights the fuse on the other, but then they become separate things and you process them, and it just gives opportunity to a reckoning, spiritually. And so the record is hard and it's heavy and it's sad, but you can dance to parts of it, I think. And, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done, in my professional life or otherwise. It was really hard. It took me a lot of years to figure out how to say what's in those 13 songs. And, but I'm real proud of it. And to me it was, and I hope anyone will forgive anything that will seem insensitive about this language, but it felt like a coming out. It felt like, and to my friends who are, some of my dearest friends who've gone through, a coming out, to their families, who are gay and went through a really hard time of processing how in the world to find language to prepare the people who you deeply care about to learn something about you that is true but unexpected. I have talked about it with them, and they obviously I couldn't begin to imagine what they went through in that process, but they did at least empathize with me in saying, like, yeah, I could see how it's akin to that. I can see how it's like, because I remember before the record came out thinking, oh man, like, I need to talk to my brother. I need to talk to my parents. I've got a handful of friends I need to talk about. Most of those people knew because they knew me well, but it felt like going on the public record about something intimate and vulnerable and personal, but important to me, and something I wanted to be on the public record, and that's what the record feels like to me.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think the album is a very good representation to what you intended to say. I mean, there's just so many tracks that say, I mean, all of the tracks, it's just a really, as you said, it's like a heavy album, but there's so much in each track, in each song, that you can sort of unpack and look at in different ways. and consider. And I think that, a lot of people that have gone through deconstruction, as you said, of whether they've moved from a fundamentalist thing to something less so. There is this element of real pain and grief. It's not a simple thing. And I think your album is a very, very strong testament to that.
I really appreciate it. And to me, it is heavy, but it felt like a heaviness that leads to a lightness. I mean, because by the end of it, and I can tell you that, like, in terms of where I'm in my feelings about those things now, I've never been happier. I've never felt more liberated or free. I've never felt more free of burden than I do now. And it was a result of what's in those songs. And I remember there being a moment where as I said before, I didn't know if I would even make music again. I didn't know, how do I even describe this? How do I even go about the process of trying to write this? And what finally tipped me over the edge, and I'm curious if this might be a segue into the last bit here, but was thinking to myself, like, okay, I'm going through this. I'm going through two very painful things at once. These simultaneous two divorces, vertical, horizontal. And as I'm looking around for comfort in the way of music and soundtrack, I just wasn't finding much. I wasn't finding a lot of music that was especially comforting to me, or that had really documented either of those processes. It was really hard, and I really needed it, and I mostly couldn't find it. And my creative MO in my life tends to be what I need and can't find, I make.
Right.
That's what's led me into doing most of the things I've done in my career. And now, what I did have and find was another one of your previous guests, Dave Bazan, who is a friend. I would consider him a good friend. I mean, I'm a way bigger fan of his than we are friends by a long stretch. I mean, I'm a huge fan of his, and I found his, and all of this are things that he has given me some very good counsel over the years in terms of navigating and finding my way through and how to do. It's tricky, but his music was extremely comforting and extremely nourishing to me. I feel like when you're coming into the church, you come down the aisle, they hand you a Bible and a couple of books and whatever they give you. When you're leaving the church, when you're exiting, they basically hand you a Dave Bazan record. They hand you Curse Your Branches, they hand you Strange Negotiations. I mean, his music. He is one of the very few people, man. I'm touched as I'm talking about it. One of the very few people who has, as thoughtfully and lovingly and carefully and in such an articulate way, really, journaled that process and his journey and to great personal expense. I mean, there's been a cost to a guy like him to choosing to address those things. Little as I know it feels to him like a choice to do it, there were many moments that it just fucking kept me alive. Because something about the providing of language and soundtrack and hearing someone who I knew understood and I knew had gone before me, right. And I couldn't have been more grateful and felt less alone. And it meant everything to me. There were a lot of hard moments, a lot of hard nights. That music saved me in a lot of ways. And music's never really done that for me. I've never been especially emotional about music, and I've never been super deeply attached to music in the way that, for instance, I am about movies. Like visual storytelling and narrative is the thing that really gets down to my soul. But music is important to me. But Dave's music during these years went somewhere that music had not for me ever previously. And so what I'm trying to say is I knew that his music was there. I knew that people, were finding him and those records, and that was comforting. But I was like, it's not enough. Like, there should be more. And because people need to know they're not alone. People need to know that there are good things on the other side. It's not just grief and deconstruction, but it's reconstruction and joy and freedom and new life even that can come. And ironically, I hear the irony of all that language sounding very much like the advertisement for the Christian gospel. But I have found all that on the other side, and people need to know. They need to know they're not alone. And
Yep.
so it became, and that was eventually the thing that tipped me over into deciding I had to finish this record. I had to continue to make music because I wanted to be part of that witness that Dave has so faithfully done for so many years. I wanted to be part of that trajectory and that legacy. I wanted to be part of that, and I wanted to be that soft place that people could land if they found themselves in similar circumstances and needed soundtrack. I wanted to help provide it if I could, and that's what eventually pushed me back into music.
Yeah. And
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's I think that's wonderful, because I mean, the more sort of albums that are out there that sort of address these particular experiences, because there is something there's something about them, there's something about going through some really shit days and months and years where where the thing that you constructed your whole outlook on life around starts to fall apart. And
music and art is a place where people go for comfort.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, even beyond what you've done with the record, you've taken it to another sort of level that I through your podcast that you started, which you basically you reached out and let people know, like, hey, I put this album out here. It's like this chronicles me losing my faith. This chronicles me starting over with my belief and with so much of the way I see the world and all of this. And you're not alone. And so just call me up and we'll talk about the music. We'll talk about what you want to talk about. I mean that, and I honestly, I love the name of your podcast a lot. Like, The Airing of Grief, I think is such a great way to encapsulate what that is, because yes, I mean, there is a lot, as you said, and as I can attest to, as a lot of people can attest to, there is so much good on the other side of leaving these harmful beliefs behind. There's a grieving process that has to happen when you let them go. And so the way in which you frame it like that, I think is just very, very powerful, and it lends a weight to the story that I think people that have a different life experience, that they didn't have a faith and then lose it, or have a faith and then have it radically change in a painful way, don't necessarily understand what it means to grieve that. They might see it and say, oh, well, you're better off now, right? I mean,
right.
Well, yes, I am, but that doesn't mean it didn't suck.
Right. Well, and it's just like situations where people go through hard things that are unrelated to spirituality, and they live with the pain of it for a long time. And then as that pain starts to subside, you actually miss the pain, not because you like it, but because you lived with it for so long. Right. And, you live like as you start to become less preoccupied with the absence of something, you start to miss that ache, even if you're healthier and happier, because you lived with it for so long. And I think it dignifies it to frame it as a grief process. And that is how a lot of people experience it. And my thing with The Airing of Grief was also like, even if someone's grief is with me and they're mad and they want to evangelize me or berate me about, how could you have how can you go from all these years of professing this in such a public way, and even writing songs that affected me in my own spiritual beliefs, and then go, here, how could you do it? And I'm mad about that, or I want to, try and persuade you otherwise, or if your grief was with the institution of the church and not even with the idea of God at all, or with God or Jesus or whatever it is, I just wanted to, my instinct was to try and create, if I could, facilitate a safe place for people to be able to say what they needed to say and get it off their chest, and to process it a little bit with somebody who could understand. And I mean, and the way that we kind of stumbled and backed into the whole podcast was that the initial response to the record didn't seem, like on social media and wherever I could kind of discern it, didn't really seem to be about the record. It seemed to light the fuse on people wanting to tell their stories of spiritual heartache or transition, as you've described, or deconstruction, or whatever it was. It made people want to talk about that.
Right.
And so almost none of the response to the record was about the record. And I thought that was fascinating. And I try to make it my job to notice things like that, and those are coordinates to me. Those are significant. I find meaning in those patterns, and I'm a hyper analytical, detail, rational type thinker. And so so as I was seeing that, talking to some pals about that, the idea came up, of like, we should create a place for this to happen intentionally and in an organized way, as opposed to unintentionally in a clumsy way that, because it's going to happen either way. People seem to want to tell these stories. So let's either provide a way for them to do it that could have some greater scale or meaning, or maybe that's a wasted opportunity, because I think something meaningful could happen. And so it started, as like just making kind of putting the offer out online of saying, if you want to write a letter to tell your story, or if you want to talk to me on the phone every day for an hour or so, I'm going to spend 10 minutes at a time taking phone calls over Skype. And if you want to tell me your story or air whatever grief you have, you can schedule 10 minutes and let's get on the phone and let's talk, and we'll make it anonymous. We'll bleep your name out, but I want to record them all, because I feel like for every person who might be willing to make a phone call or write a letter, there's going to be 50 who wouldn't.
Right.
But I'm suspicious that they might find themselves resonant with or wrapped up in the language of some of those stories that someone was willing to tell. And I wanted, for the benefit of those people, to record them. And we weren't even sure what we were going to do with it at first. I just knew I wanted to do that. And maybe it would just be for me and the person that I would speak to on these calls, but it might be more. There might be more. And something about the airing of grief wasn't just about grief, but also, like, we wanted to air it. Like, we wanted to put it on the air. We wanted to take it out into the world, and for the benefit of people who felt isolated, alone and hopeless, that might feel different. So I started recording these phone calls, and just the stories immediately from the get-go were incredible. I couldn't believe what people were willing to share and what people had gone through. And so I had a handful of friends, and Jamie Lee Finch, who you mentioned before, is one of our producers, and my friend Kevin McDougall and my friend John Allen. The four of us decided to band together. We're a very we have a lot of weird skills between the four of us, and we decided to work together on this, to arrange it and curate it by topic, and to kind of like put the calls together unedited, just a call or two, and then a letter read by one of our producers into each episode, and make these kind of short episodes of people telling their stories. And we started doing it, and just immediately really drafting behind podcasts like yours and conversations that folks like you and even on the bleeding edge of it, like folks like the Liturgist or the Inglorious Bastards, or there's like a lot of funny and strange and the deconstructionist guys, or there's a lot of people that it seems like it's a conversation that wants to be had. It's like people want to congregate and talk about it, or be heard, or hear people's stories to be comforted, or and so we started to put it out in the world and just immediately found, literally in the first week, the stories that came back to us, just of the few people who were listening, were so meaningful to us that we're like, okay, well, this is a thing we need to figure out how to sustain, and we want to keep doing. And I've done more than 100 of these calls now.
Oh wow, yeah.
And that we've recorded, and we're planning our second season. We're 2/3 of the way, almost done with our first season of the podcast, and planning our second season, and planning even live events where we're gonna tour, and I'll play songs from the new record, and we'll bring Jamie and Kevin out with us, and we'll have conversations live with a group of people, and talk and deconstruct and process and weep or laugh or argue, whatever people want to do. And so it feels significant to me. It feels meaningful, and it feels like a thing that is going to be part of my life for the next few years. And so it's been really surprising and gratifying, and like a strange ancillary thing that has come from the record that was unexpected. Yeah.
Yeah, and it does feel like this outgrowth, like this thing that came from the same place as your record, and it's really neat. It's a very, very, I think, unique and interesting way to have a podcast. Like you made an album, it had a reaction, and the reaction is this whole other thing, and it's really exciting to see, and it's really really rewarding to listen to. Like you said, there is something sort of happening in the water. Like,
yes,
these conversations keep happening. They
do.
They need, like, there are kindred sort of podcasts and kindred sort of conversations and communities that are popping up, and It needs to happen, and so
people are recongregating. I mean, that's what's happening, because we're desperate for it, and we need to know that we're not alone, and we're not.
Right.
We're really not. There are arguably more people who've been recycled through the church and are now on the other side of it, in this cloud of invisible witnesses, than there are even currently in it. I mean, it's.
Yep.
The church is constantly generating deconverts. And so there's a steady supply who need good resources and a safe place and a soft place to land. And that's why I so love what you're doing. And it certainly was a real lighthouse for us, in terms of like, and showing us the way, and also telling us that it was going to be worth doing it, that there were people who cared enough to put some intention behind it. And, so we're certainly, starting to kind of crawl down the path that you and others have kind of cleared and paved a little bit. So, it's, so I'm proud of this work, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And you should be. It's really great. Where can people find the podcast? Where can they find your music? I know I've had you on the phone here for over an hour and a half now. So
I know, and I told you I was going to try to be so short.
No, it's perfect. I think everything you've shared has been great. So I want.
It's been such a pleasure. So it's all pretty easy. My music side of things is just at DerekWebb.com, which is DerekWebb. That's where you can find my music and touring and stuff like that, and buy records. And then the podcast is at theairingofgrief.com. And it's also just available anywhere people go looking for podcasts. You can find it, The Airing of Grief. And we still, are taking calls. We're kind of shut down for a minute while we transition seasons, but that's going to be a permanent part of what we're doing moving forward. Is we want anyone who's listening to at any point be able to hijack and take it over and be the podcast and be on it. And we like that. It feels democratic, and it feels fair and equal, and we want everyone to have a chance to speak. And so that's a thing we're pursuing on into the year. And but that's where you can find us.
Awesome. Anything else I didn't mention or get to ask you that we should add here at the end?
Oh, surely if I haven't said it in the last hour and a half, it shouldn't be said at this point.
Well, I just want to thank you again for coming on the show and for talking about your music and your career. I think there's so much that the listeners, will resonate with, and I'm thankful for where you are now too, and I'm glad you're continuing to share your perspective on the world. So thank you so much for coming on.
It's just been such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
The reason it's been so long since we talked, I'm not ready to show up and feel nothing. I don't even feel sad anymore, just always looking for your replacement. I still believe